Hello, it's good to have you join me in my study. In our thinking about the atonement, we come today to a new subject, namely the satisfaction of divine justice. We saw in our study of the biblical materials that one of the key roles of sacrifice in the Old Testament is the propitiation of God's wrath. What this translates to is the satisfaction of divine justice. And the question here is, how does punishing Christ serve to satisfy the demands of God's justice? Even if my sins are imputed to Christ, why doesn't the punishment of Christ simply serve to remove his own imputed guilt, but not mine? How is it that the punishment of Christ serves to remove my guilt and to satisfy the demands of God's punishment for my sins? Well, today we want to take up that topic. And I think that the first point that needs to be made is similar to the one I made in discussing the justification of punishment. Namely, this objection requires contextualization within a broader theory of ethics. Namely, who determines what is right and wrong in the first place? On Christian theism, God himself is the moral legislator, the moral judge, and the moral executor of the moral law, so that it is up to God to establish the moral law, interpret it, and enforce it. But in that case, this objection becomes rather odd. Namely, who is to gainsay God if God himself determines that the demands of his moral law, the demands of his justice, are met vicariously by Christ's being punished in our place? If God determines that this satisfied the demands of his justice, who's to disagree? Who's to gainsay what God says? God himself is the source, the interpreter, and the executor of the moral law. And so it's up to God to decide what meets the demands of his justice. So, given the broader context of a divine command theory of ethics, it seems to me that once again this objection just can't get off the ground. If God determines that the demands of his justice are met through Christ's vicarious punishment, then God cannot be called into question on this matter.